Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at two really significant moments in recent U.S. history, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and, of course, the January 6th attack on the Capitol.
Right, big events. And instead of just going over the headlines again, we want to sort of dig underneath, find the connections.
Exactly. Give you a clearer picture, maybe a more insightful one, about the forces really at play there.
And to do that, we're tapping into the perspective of Tim Heffy. He's a former federal prosecutor. And he had this really unique viewpoint because he actually led the investigations into both events.
Both Charlottesville and January 6th. That's quite something.
It is. And he talked about this recently with Glenn Kirshner, and we've pulled out, the key insights from that conversation for this deep dive.
So the goal here is really to cut through some of the noise. Yeah. Focus on the core stuff, how law enforcement was prepared or maybe unprepared.
The role of misinformation, which seems huge these days.
Definitely. And just what do these incidents tell us? Bigger picture about the challenges American democracy is facing right now.
And we should probably mention his book too, right? Harbingers.
Oh, yeah, good point. Harbingers. What January 6th and Charlottesville reveal about rising threats to American democracy. I mean, that title alone tells you his focus, and it comes directly from his work on these investigations.
Absolutely. So maybe let's start with Heffy himself. Who is he? Why is his view so important here?
Okay. So, yeah, longtime federal prosecutor. He was a U.S. attorney, also served as general counsel at UVA, University of Virginia.
Right. So deep legal background. But the key thing, like you said, is heading up both investigations. Charlottesville review, January 6th, House Select Committee chief investigator.
That direct experience, being right in the thick of it, it gives him a perspective few others could possibly have. He wasn't just reading summaries. He was, leading the teams, asking the hard questions.
Yeah, piecing it all together. And that experience really fed into the book, Harbingers. And from what I understand, it's not just a, dry report.
No, apparently not. It sounds like it blends the history, the procedural stuff of an investigation, but also has elements of, true crime writing, trying to give you a feel for how things actually unfolded.
He said himself it's meant to be a kind of behind-the-scenes look, right? Not just the days themselves, but the whole run-up, the things that happened or didn't happen that allowed the violence to occur.
The preventable stuff, the lessons learned, or hopefully learned.
Exactly. So, okay, where do we start? What did he see as the big common threads?
Well, one really striking one he points to is the law enforcement response, or maybe the lack of an adequate response.
Given his roles in reviewing Charlottesville and investigating Jan 6th, he was perfectly placed to see that. What stood out to him?
Well, this is pretty jarring. He basically argues that despite getting plenty of warnings in both cases, the lack of preparation wasn't really about missing the intel.
Okay, so not an intelligence failure in the classic sense. The information wasn't there.
That's what he pushes back against.
Yeah.
He says the warnings, the intelligence suggesting a real potential for violence were there for both events.
But the response didn't match the warnings.
Precisely. The necessary resources, the right strategies to actually prevent large-scale violence, they just weren't deployed effectively either time.
And that leads him to a conclusion that might ruffle some feathers.
You could say that. It's definitely provocative. He suggests these two events aren't isolated failures.
Okay.
He sees them as part of a dangerous pattern, a recurring failure within law enforcement, specifically when it comes to understanding and preparing for the threat from largely white, domestic, violent extremist groups.
Wow. Okay. That is a strong statement. So a pattern of underestimation specifically related to that demographic.
That seems to be his argument. And he stresses that unless this pattern is really confronted, honestly looked at and dealt with, we're just setting ourselves up for it to happen again.
That's quite the conclusion. What's his reasoning behind that? How does he support that claim?
Well, it comes down to how we assess danger in the first place.
Yeah.
He argues, that assessment is always subjective, isn't it?
Sure. Someone has to decide how dangerous a situation or group actually is.
Right. Whether it's an officer on the street or an analyst looking at intelligence reports, it involves judgment calls. And it's there. In that subjective space, he thinks implicit bias becomes a really big factor.
Implicit bias.
Yeah.
So the unconscious stuff, not deliberate prejudice, but those automatic associations we all carry around.
Exactly. Unconscious attitudes, stereotypes that just kind of shape how we see things, how we react, without us even realizing it sometimes.
And how does he connect that specifically to Charlottesville and Jan 6 versus, say, other situations?
He draws a pretty stark contrast. He asks us to look at the law enforcement posture in Charlottesville and on January 6th, where the participants were predominantly white, and compare that to, for example, the response during the George Floyd protests.
Which involved mostly black and brown individuals and often saw a much more militarized police presence.
Right. That's the contrast he highlights.
So let me make sure I understand his point. He's not saying the individual officers were consciously thinking racist thoughts?
No, he's very clear on that. He says he didn't find evidence of explicit racism driving decisions in the investigations he led for these events. But he firmly believes that implicit bias in assessing the level of danger played a significant role.
So the unconscious bias potentially led to, like, downplaying the threat from the Charlottesville and Jan 6th crowds.
While perhaps overestimating the threat in other contexts, like the George Floyd protests. That's the dynamic he's pointing to.
And he argues we have to acknowledge that bias exists to even begin fixing the problem.
Exactly. It's uncomfortable for sure,
Yeah.
but he sees it as crucial.
Okay, it's a challenging idea. Let's shift slightly to leadership. Did Hiffy's work uncover specific leadership failures that fed into these outcomes?
Yeah, definitely. For January 6th especially, there was this strong feeling that the Capitol Police were just, well, deprived of the resources they needed, undermanned, under-equipped for what was coming.
And Hafey talked to the chief at the time, Steve Sund?
He did. And he mentions Sund initially described January 6th as basically a free speech event.
That sounds familiar. Didn't the commander in Charlottesville say something similar?
Yeah, Hiffy draws that parallel directly. The Charlottesville police commander apparently compared the Unite the Right rally plan to, like, planning for a Jave Matthews Band concert or a UVA football game.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That does seem like a fundamental misunderstanding of the potential for violence.
That's Hiffy's point entirely. A failure to see the massive difference in intent and, frankly, the gear people were bringing. Concertgoers don't usually show up in tactical vests looking for a fight.
No, they generally don't. A huge difference.
And this failure to recognize the unique nature of the threat in both cases was a major contributing factor, according to Hiffy.
Did the unprecedented role of the President Trump, inciting things, did that play into the miscalculation on Jan 6th?
Hiffy acknowledges that, yeah. There was just no playbook for a sitting president actively encouraging supporters to march on the Capitol, potentially violently.
Hard to plan for something that's never happened before at that level.
Right. It undoubtedly made accurately gauging the threat that day even more difficult for law enforcement leaders.
Okay, so we have issues with preparedness, bias and threat assessment, leadership missteps. What else connects these events in Heffy's view?
Another big one is the whole information landscape, how people get their news, what they believe.
Earlier, the information ecosystem, right? How did that contribute?
Well, he contrasts, maybe an older era where people got news from fewer sources, maybe more balanced ones, or at least sources trying for balance.
Yeah, the network news, the local paper.
Right. Compared to now, where so much is filtered through social media feeds, driven by algorithms.
Algorithms designed to keep you clicking, not necessarily to inform you accurately.
Exactly. They're built to maximize engagement, Heffy says. And often that means showing you stuff that confirms what you already think, or stuff that provokes a strong reaction, not necessarily stuff that's true or gives you the full picture.
So you end up in these echo chambers.
Pretty much. Where certain narratives, even false ones, get amplified like crazy, and there's often very little effective content moderation to challenge them.
And he connects this directly to the mindset of people at these events.
Yeah, particularly for January 6th. He emphasizes that many people there genuinely believe the election was stolen. It wasn't an act for many of them.
A mistaken belief, but sincerely held.
Right. And that belief was constantly fed and reinforced by the information environment they were in, these online echo chambers, and, of course, amplified by certain political figures.
That leads pretty naturally into another point he makes, doesn't it, about the general atmosphere, the level of, well, hatred.
Yeah, he has a chapter called It's Harder to Hate Up Close, which is a powerful idea in itself.
But he also observes that right now, hatred is palpable. You can almost feel it in the air these days.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak assessment. And he ties it to a few key things.
What does he see as the main drivers of this palpable hatred?
Well, first, those social media algorithms again, the echo chambers creating division, often for profit.
Yeah. Okay. What else? Second, he points to this growing feeling among many people that government, that institutions are really just there to protect the powerful, the privileged elite.
A sense of being left out, or that the system is rigged.
Kind of, yeah. And third, he calls out leaders who, instead of trying to bridge divides, actively exploit them. stoke the flames for political advantage.
A pretty toxic mix. Divisive algorithms, perceived institutional unfairness, and leaders playing on those divisions.
Exactly. And Heffy thinks this has actually shifted the fundamental divide in the country.
How so? Not just left versus right anymore.
That's his argument. He suggests the core split now is more like insider versus outsider.
Insider versus outsider. Explain that a bit more.
He sees this deep distrust brewing across the political spectrum, actually, towards established institutions. Government, yeah, but also mainstream media, universities, even science.
So people feeling like these big institutions don't represent them, don't understand them, maybe are even hostile to them. That's the feeling he's describing. A sense of being on the outside looking in, regardless of whether you lean left or right on traditional issues.
And the danger of that.
Well, you get these silos, right? People just retreating into their own groups, trusting only their own sources. And it becomes almost impossible to connect with people who see things differently.
You start assuming the worst about the other side.
Yeah, attributing sinister motives because you just don't have any real interaction or common ground anymore. He brings up that Michelle Obama quote.
It's harder to hate up close.
That's the one, underscoring how much we need more chances for real face-to-face interaction across these divides. But those chances seem to be dwindling.
Wow. Okay, that's covered a lot of the more troubling aspects Heffy raised. But you mentioned he also talks about hope, about courage.
He does. He definitely does. Drawing on his long career as a prosecutor, he talks about witnessing some really terrible things, obviously, but also seeing incredible courage.
Where did he see that courage?
In victims, for one. People who survive violent robberies, sexual assaults, major fraud, their resilience. But also in witnesses who stepped up, detectives who wouldn't give up, even defense attorneys acting with integrity in tough situations.
So finding the positive even amidst the negative.
Yeah, he has this phrase, something like tragedy creates opportunities for heroism. He saw that play out again and again.
And he shares some specific stories in the book that really drive this home.
He does. One really powerful one involves a woman named Carol Watkins.
Okay.
Her son, Anthony Watkins, was murdered as part of this big, complex RICO case Heffy prosecuted. A case, actually, that you were involved in, too, weren't you?
Yes, I remember the case well. Very tragic.
Incredibly tragic. And the man who killed her son, a hitman named Oscar V., he eventually cooperated with the prosecution, admitted to multiple murders.
Right. So Carol Watkins is at the sentencing for the man who murdered her son.
Exactly. And everyone's expecting, anger, grief, maybe calls for vengeance. Understandable. Right. But instead, she faces Oscar V. and she tells him, I want you to know that I love you and that I forgive you.
Wow. That's extraordinary.
Heffy describes it as just this unbelievable moment of grace, holding on to her values, her faith, even after suffering the worst imaginable loss. It clearly stuck with him.
I can imagine. A profound act of forgiveness.
Truly. And there's another poignant moment from that same case involving Oscar V. himself.
The hitman.
Yeah. He had, as part of his cooperation, admitted to killing several people. One was a case of mistaken identity. He killed a man named Jaime Pereira, thinking he was someone else.
Terrible.
At Oscar V.'s sentencing, he'd actually taken the time to learn some Spanish. And he turned to Mr. Pereira's family, who were there in court, and apologized directly to them in Spanish for the loss he'd caused.
Even after everything he'd done, that must have been incredibly emotional.
Heffy said it was deeply affecting for everyone there. A reminder, maybe, of the shred of humanity that can exist even in the darkest situations.
Those stories do offer a different perspective, a necessary one, after discussing Charlottesville and Jan 6. So bringing it all together, what's the main message Heffy wants people to take from Harbingers? What's the call to action?
He frames the book, really, as a call to participate and also a call to care.
Participate and care. How?
He uses this powerful analogy from the 9/11 Commission report. The stories of firefighters instinctively running towards the danger, towards the fire.
Yeah.
Heffy argues that, in a way, every American needs to do that now, to run toward the fire. The challenges facing our democracy, we can't just stand back.
So active engagement, not passive observation.
Exactly. And he gets specific. Educate yourself constantly. Talk to your neighbors, especially the ones you disagree with. Vote, obviously. Get involved in civic life somehow, whatever that looks like for you.
It's about individual responsibility then.
Very much so. He says he has faith in the American people, fundamentally. But that faith relies on people actually stepping up and taking action. Democracy isn't a spectator sport, basically.
We have to be the agents of change, not just wait for it.
That's the core message.
Okay. So let's try to sum up this deep dive. We've looked through Tim Heffy's eyes at the threads connecting Charlottesville and January 6th.
Right. We saw the shared patterns in law enforcement failures, the lack of readiness despite warnings.
The really challenging idea of implicit bias influencing how danger is perceived.
Yep. And the huge impact of our fragmented, often misleading information environment. How that fuels division and mistrust.
That erosion of trust in big institutions, government, media, you name it.
And ultimately, Heffy's call for us all to show up, to be courageous, to get involved.
And maybe that provocative thought to leave people chewing on is Heffy's idea that the main fault line isn't left-right anymore.
But maybe insider versus outsider. That feeling of being excluded or misrepresented by the systems of power. It certainly makes you think about your own assumptions, doesn't it?
It really does. Where do you fit? Where do others fit? How does that shape things?
And we end, I think, where Heffy wants us to end, with that call to action, that challenge to run toward the fire.
To participate, to care, to actively work at safeguarding democratic ideals. It's a reminder that individual actions matter, they add up.
A powerful note to end on.